This is Grenfell Tower in West London, where on the 14th of June 2017, a catastrophic fire claimed 72 lives. Many more could have been saved had they not followed official advice to stay in their apartments. Escape routes were also severely limited, and it's been claimed that Celotex, which made the insulation, used a different, more fire-resistant product to win the safety certificate, and then a more flammable product in public use, one which emitted fumes such as cyanide when burning. The inquiry has had some notable absences. The Housing Secretary, James Brokenshire, and the Housing Minister, Dominic Raab, have not come and don't plan to come. The same is true of Nick Hurd, the Home Office Minister, who is the main government contact for victims. Executives from Ryden, the company which refurbished the tower with combustible cladding, are not coming either. Neither are the cost consultants Artalia, who are involved in value engineering by cutting costs. The architects Studio E have also declined to contribute. And the hardship continues. Despite assurances that survivors would be offered permanent furnished social housing within 12 months, the government itself admits progress has been too slow and that it was understandable the community would feel let down. Residents claim properties are damp, too small or just unsuitable. The inquiry is revealing the human impact of the disaster and also the character of the community which lived in and around the 24-storey council block and which was incinerated by the deadly fire. How much faith can we have in the inquiry into the Grenfell Tower disaster? And why is flammable material still being used as insulation despite the lessons of Grenfell? Simple questions with important answers. Many have claimed the Grenfell fire disaster was avoidable, as the health and safety concerns had been raised many times before this tragedy took place. Does the public agree, and why? We asked them. Here's what they told us.
I'm not sure what's wrong, because some people advise people to go upstairs. Some people we have no quick help, and which is ending a big disaster, really.
If it could have been prevented, then it should have been prevented. But I wouldn't want to state an opinion or blame anyone because, you know, I don't feel well informed enough, and I don't feel like the media has informed people enough. They've just stirred an opinion.
There's a lot of things that could have been prevented, from this disaster, and it's a shame to see how it's turned out.
Don't believe that was anyway done. Maybe a little bit of neglect, but not, like people are sort of blaming all the councils and everything else. Yeah, it is wrong.
Unfortunately, these things only change when things happen, disasters happen.
The information felt like the building was unsafe for them to come and check, but they didn't do any checking at all.
It's worse. They should have put better things in the building. It will not happen.
The council was told multiple times by the housing association responsible for the building, I think it was called Lancaster West Estate.
I agree that the Grenfell fire was wholly avoidable. I think there were enough warnings. I think that the fire happened because of discrimination, because of poverty, because of austerity. All of those things could be avoided. I think that the people living in the tower were being treated like second-class or third-class citizens when their concerns that they raised repeatedly over and over again should have been listened to. Some of the residents were actually threatened when they did raise concerns, which is atrocious. And the fact that you had people who were disabled, who were elderly, babies and young children living on the highest floors who would not be able to escape in a disaster situation is absolutely atrocious.
Yes, it was an entirely preventable tragedy, which some people label as an atrocity. The reason that it was man-made and the reason it was preventable isn't just because the Grenfell Action Group and residents of Grenfell questioned the manner in which the renovation was taking place and the redevelopment was taking place, because there were shoddy materials going in the whole way through. There was restrictions of space within the tower. There was the way in which Ryden were leaving the site, including the lift. All of these concerns were raised, not the cladding and not the insulation. Now, there are certain individuals, including Andrew O'Hagan, who have critiqued the response and the attitude of the community and of the Grenfell Action Group going into the inquiry as it's framed, because they say that all of the protestations aren't actually relevant to actually what caused the fire. But then that requires, for you to actually hold that level of criticism of individuals involved, means that you would require residents to actually have oversight into the materials being placed around their blocks. And at what point do you actually require a state or central government or a local authority to do those checks for you? If you believe that it's residents themselves who should fire test everything, then somehow we live in a completely dystopian world.
It's been claimed that just 1/3 of families affected are now in a permanent home, leaving 2/3 still unsure and without permanent housing a year on from the disaster. What are the public's thoughts on this?
I understand it's difficult, but the government should help people. It's quicker because, as you know, the children need the schools and they need accommodations.
If someone's home, they want somewhere permanent to live, and it is the government's job, especially because that happened. If they said they were supposed to get them houses, then they should deliver when they say and not prolong things.
So it shouldn't have been hard for them to do. As you can see, there's bundles of houses being built and being done up and that, and they're empty. I honestly believe that they can accommodate people, and I can't see the reason why it has taken so long for these people that have lost all their possessions, they've lost everything in Grenfell Tower, and up to now nothing has really been verified or sorted.
I think it's absolutely atrocious because it's not only they've lost their belongings as well. It's not like they've just lost a home. Some of them people have been living in there for 25, 30 years. They've lost their whole, not just your furniture, but their whole outlook on life at the home.
These people were hurt and trapped by the situation, by a lack of oversight from a council and by corner cutting and cost cutting, and now that same attitude means that they don't have anywhere to live.
I think it's unfair, but we are living in central London and we all know what it's like to try and find properties in this region at the moment, and it's a difficult task for the local council to find everybody a residence that is suitable for their needs.
I think that's ridiculous. They should have got placed at the same time. They should have, because why it took them so long for these people to have somewhere to live?
Many people were given options of atrocious housing. So say a handful of people got off the 16th floor. They stayed in the Westway Sports Centre on mattresses on the tennis courts for weeks, and then they were offered alternative accommodation in a neighbouring tower block, looking on to their block that had just caught fire. Families of 4 or 5 with their children in a bed sit. It's just shocking.
I think it's inexcusable that the families who were displaced because of the fire have still not been homed permanently. There is no excuse for it. You're talking about Kensington and Chelsea Council, which is the richest local authority, not just in the UK, but in Europe. If it was rich people that have been displaced, I'm pretty sure that they would have established and built tailor-made apartments, houses, whatever it was for them, very, very quickly. The fact that they've been demonised because they want, something that's equivalent to where they lived before, that's adequate for their needs, that can house their family, that's safe, that meets their requirements in terms of schooling and commuting to work, is not much to ask for.
I mean, that's a really interesting one, because the promise was made from central government, and it was a massive ask, especially with the shortage of social housing left within RBKC, particularly with the amount of houses lost with the Grenfell fire. So housing people as quickly as the government said it would was always going to be a tall order, and they haven't met it famously now, right? It is a scandal that people haven't been housed appropriately, but people have gone through a massive trauma. They're still seeking social housing, and they don't want to exist in tower blocks that they deem to be unsafe. So it's a very particular and bespoke process for every individual involved, and we shouldn't be too concerned with time. We should be more concerned with how they feel about it. Now, the psychology of being in a hotel for a year is incredibly difficult, and those individuals need better support. So, I mean, the fact that people are in temporary accommodation is problematic, but it's better temporary accommodation than hotels. So as long as people feel comfortable and included within the process and their needs are being met, I think that's the most important demand.
Public inquiry began almost a year after the disaster. Does the public trust this inquiry, and what do they hope it will bring?
I'm sure that we have to find something. What happened? Because especially we've got some friends, they live there, and we're waiting.
Doesn't look great for them. Like, they should turn up. If they're supposed to be making decisions and, you know, these are people's lives, it's their job in the government to actually look after people.
Me personally, I honestly hope that it does go away, the inquiry, because there is a lot to answer for.
It's sad, and it is, and I hope for their families, because I know quite a few of them, that they do get an answer, or peace of mind, if nothing else.
I would hope that it reaches into the actual sources of the problem rather than, I mean, there's no one person to blame, there's a lot of people to blame here. A lot of people made some really dodgy decisions, and I hope they're held responsible, but I don't know enough about it to hold any judgment. I'm waiting to see what comes out at the other end.
I would say it's a political inquiry, so there will be some truths, there will be some things hidden. It takes a lot longer than a year to get to the bottom of the real story.
They don't really see me coming yet because I have to get all my information together to make sure we do our friends proud, and we get the answers what we really deserve to have.
It's a cover-up. It's for the public to be quiet, to quieten the public. It's for the masses. It's not for the people affected. The gentleman who's in charge of the inquiry has already been accused and of social cleansing in the borough of Westminster.
I attended part of the inquiry this week, and of course what we've heard so far is the testimonies by family members who lost their loved ones, so paying tribute to the 72 people that died, which included the baby of one of the members of my union, the PCS union, whose mother was pregnant on the night of the fire and who didn't survive, baby Logan. It was traumatizing but beautiful at the same time, painful, you know, but uplifting to hear the stories and testimonies by family members. But what they had to go through to share those stories, you know, I don't know how they found the strength. So I think where we are at the moment, we don't know how the public inquiry is really going to go. I think it was right that we had the tributes paid. And I'm also very, very concerned that some people didn't get visas to enter the UK and then couldn't give their tribute directly. They had to give it through lawyers and representatives, and they were very upset about that. And one family couldn't come in addition because they said there were problems with accommodation in the UK, which is just atrocious. Why aren't they sorting that out for them so that they could attend?
I mean, the terms of reference for the inquiry are relatively limited. That's always been a problem with it because it's a directive that came through the Home Office and Theresa May itself. Morbick has said in his response to Theresa May, which is relatively unprecedented, that there are parts of which the community demanded that we will not be within the scope of the inquiry. So it will have its limitations. That being said, the role of Celotex, the role of Arconic, the role of Studio Architects, the role of the KCTMO and RBKC, all of the parties involved in this avoidable tragedy should have very uncomfortable home truths spoken, both about the culture of contempt that led to protestations being muted and to the deregulation that allowed for combustible materials to be placed on a building 50 meters higher than it should have been, and which killed 72 people. And the inquiry should also clarify some of the myths that are going around in regards to the response from the fire service, which essentially I think is punching down. What we're seeing in this process is the absolving of central government and local government responsibility, a blaming on the nebulous corporate sector and rescue services. And those rescue services did an incredible job in incredibly hard circumstances. Yes, in hindsight, things could have been done. The stay put policy should have been changed, but people didn't realize that compartmentalization had been completely broken until it was obvious. And I mean, I have great sympathy for the individuals of the fire service who advise people in ways that killed them, but they didn't know now. Like, it's horrible that we are witnessing individuals who are part of a rescue effort being hurt and demeaned in this way.
During a debate in Parliament in May 2018, it was revealed that of the 201 households which had accepted offers of temporary or permanent accommodation, 138 have moved into their accommodation. Of these, 64 are in temporary accommodation and 74 in permanent homes. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister claims fire and rescue services have visited more than 1,250 tower blocks around the country since the fire. Of these, about 300 pose the same risk to residents as Grenfell. Government ministers remain absent from the inquiry, as well as executives of companies involved in the tower's refurbishment. How does the public feel about this?
I'm sure there is somewhere we will find the truth.
I honestly believe that everybody that played a part in Grenfell Tower should come into the inquiry and say their part, and to be honest with you, at least clear their name and their responsibilities.
They're going to put one person forward, they're going to be the scapegoat for it all, and it won't be just the one person. Someone's going to pay for it at the end of the day, but I don't think it'll be the right person.
It gives me less faith in the inquiry actually coming up with any reasonable answers.
A lot of people don't want to attend purely because of being in the wrong place at the right time, and we're in a totally political environment at the moment, and those in power want to stay in power.
I have a site here, and you can see it's the Wall of Truth, and that's fighting for justice and also social housing. It's very important. And basically, if they pick on for me, then I can pick up for answers.
I think they should arrest them. They should take them to court. They should be there.
When push comes to shove, a year forward, so a couple of weeks ago, almost 11 months after the fire, Theresa May publicly admits that, well, anybody who was illegally here, who was in the building, is going to get deported. So the people who haven't come forward were justified in not coming forward because the government's double-crossing them.
I think that's wrong. I think that they must be held accountable. I think that everything and everybody and every institution and organisation and representative that possibly had anything to do with that fire happening and those lives being taken, 72 lives, and those families being displaced, needs to answer for their actions, and therefore they need to be questioned, and to be questioned they need to come before the public inquiry. So everybody should be questioned about their accountability, their responsibility, and what they did that may have contributed.
There was a court of public opinion that came after the fire. People demanded answers for what was a crime in so many senses of the word, both in regards to the regeneration, the fire itself, and then the aftermath. And within that process, a lot of people were named, and some in very aggressive ways. Some people wanted posters, etc. Now they feel that the public inquiry will absolve them, right? And so they're staying quiet until that process is complete, and we'll see that. But at the end of the day, despite the violent depictions that people have of this community, if people actually had the contrition and ability to step forward, own their issues, and be part of a process of accountability, something mirroring a process of truth and reconciliation where you say that this was a systematic issue, I was complicit in a role that was compartmentalized, I did this, and I now know the consequences of it were this, none of those people would run the risk of being hurt. And this depiction of them, of this community, and the hostility that they apparently harbour is preventing processes of reconciliation.
It's been alleged that Celotex, which made the insulation, used extra fire retardant in the sample of the product which got the safety certificate. A more flammable version of the insulation was reportedly sold for public use, including for Grenfell. Why was a more flammable version of the installation used in this way? Here's the public's view.
We need to check even the towers around, because as you saw, it's not true to something else like that.
No one builds a house to think it might get caught on fire, but you'd like to think that if your house if there was a fire, that everything would be put in place in such a way that it would make the fire, you know, as contained as possible.
People have lost lives, they've lost family, they lost their possessions, they've lost everything, down to people cutting corners. And it shouldn't have happened, right? Because, you know, this borough has got the money to do it the right way.
Exactly, because they were trying to cut costs. It was cheaper to use that. That's what it boiled down to. It was cheaper to use that. And that's the result of what happened.
I think they got away with it because local governments have been underfunded, and they are, without talking about this council specifically, they've had to cut back on all of their services like building inspection.
You can't blame the manufacturer, it's what people will pay, and we've been looking at reducing costs on the economy on multiple things for the last 5-10 years, and it'll continue. But you shouldn't cut corners.
They put the constructions out of gas in there, which they knew was a problem. Well, that's where everybody was writing to them, telling them there was gas leak, there was all that, and they never had attention to it. There's also electrics in there. There's also a nursery was in there as well. You know, and basically, like for me, they never done their homework right. They knew all about all the mistakes.
Because they're hiding something. They are. Because if they wasn't hiding something, why they giving this thing? They shouldn't.
They're friends of friends. They're looking out for each other, and so they're covering for each other. So irrespective of what materials were used, no one's going to go to prison. No one's going to get prosecuted.
I think it's shocking. I think it should be unlawful. I don't think that it should even have been sold. It should not have been lawful to be sold. The fact that the manufacturers could produce it and sell it without making those buying it aware of how flammable it was and how risky it was to have that, and that it wasn't safe to put any place where the public entered, let alone a tower block full of people living, some of whom, you know, would find it difficult escaping because of disability, because of age, and so on.
If what Panorama's report comes to be the case, then probably the greatest culprit of manslaughter on gross negligence within this whole situation are Celotex. Not only did they produce this material, which they knew to be incredibly combustible, not only did the CRE's tests show something that they then hid in the processes of marketing their product, but they also targeted the redevelopment of Grenfell to sell this particular product, knowing its combustibility. Therefore, that is criminal, right? If all of those things come to be the case. Now, that in regards to the loss of life, there is no greater cause of the spread of the fire than that. And the responsibility for that must lie with the people who knew it, which was not local government officials, which was Celotex. Right? That, to me, is an obvious outcome, but it's still conjecture. It's an if at this moment in time. We will have to see the process of the criminal investigation and the public inquiry until we know these things to be the case. What we do know is that the regeneration took place amidst protestations with people saying corners were being cut the whole way along. And it was within a culture which is widely shared, if you are a resident of the TMO, that if you had problems with them, you were treated as a problem and muted, right? Within such a context, any combustible materials, any loss of vehicular access were just treated as you being a busybody. And so the culture of contempt plus criminal negligence gave us Grenfell.
Year on from the horrific fatal disaster at Grenfell Tower, the inquiry is still continuing, with shocking revelations suggesting that the disaster could have been prevented, and 2/3 of survivors are still not in permanent housing. Many of the key players have simply failed to participate in the inquiry. A report by Muslim Air states that after the fire, the local authority was slow to provide direction, coordination and information to address multiple pressing needs. It warned the tragedy could happen again at a time when the frequency of disasters in the UK is likely to increase due to the inherent risks of life in crowded, unequal cities. Last time, warnings about Grenfell Tower were ignored, leading to a massive loss of life. Will those warnings be ignored in the future?